Finally, the time for Jake to leave Japan had come, but not before one more trip up into the mountains with his camera. So off went Jake, forever inspired by his brief trip to the land of the rising sun. For me, it was back home to get acquainted with my new flatmates and to return to the grim realities of work. As time wore on, it became increasingly apparent to me that this was not a job to which I was perfectly suited. Natural extroverts, or those with charisma, flourished in the role of the English teacher, but I am neither extroverted nor charismatic. It's not to say that I sucked. In fact, I know I made a real difference to the English capabilities and a small difference to the lives of some of my students. But working in Japan is being part of a system, and increasingly I was at odds with it because of its ancient sensibilities and inefficiencies. However, it's undoubtedly a rewarding experience and at times extremely entertaining. I've already mentioned some examples of outlandish behaviour, but for me, to completely catalogue the unique relationship that exists between student, teacher and staff member at an English conversation school would be impossible here. Suffice it to say that some level of camaraderie builds up between all involved when you've been at it long enough. Unfortunately, due to the fact that the company was run by buffoons, there was also eventually a sense of resentment amongst the rational staff. Resentment at a company that paid scant attention to the welfare of employees and clients and too much heed to controlling the market. Where was the worker protection and prosecution of false advertising, I asked myself prophetically. It was around this time that I started teaching kids, my first real contact with young children since I was one. It was a daunting experience from the start and never really got easier. When I taught kids, they often got quite unruly, and it was important to have a fail-safe activity that was guaranteed to get everyone involved. Head, shoulders, knees and toes was my fail-safe. One day, I did a help shift at this new school, and I had to teach 8 5-year-olds at once. I didn't have long to look over the lesson material, and once again, I thanked God that I had head, shoulders, knees and toes to fall back on. Just before I went into class, the regular teacher at the school told me, "Yusuke is in one of your classes. He's kind of physically impaired, but don't worry because he can do most of the activities." "Physically impaired?" I asked. "Yes," replied the teacher. "He doesn't have knees or elbows." Well, the kids in that class were the lucky participants of the world's first game of head, shoulders that day. Meanwhile, my new flatmates were proving interesting. I was truly lucky to have nice guys to live with throughout my stay. Scott was an explorer. He saw more of Japan in his first couple of months than what I saw in 2 years. Kenny was lucky enough to meet a local girl and forge a lasting relationship with her. They were embodiments of the myriad of reasons people come to Japan. I heard Scott relate a good quote from a student who was a housewife. During voting for local mayor, she said her husband was running for office. The way she put it was that she'd had a busy week because of his erection. Speaking of politics, Prime Minister Koizumi, who was in power while I was there, seemed to be a politician intent on reform, and who can wonder when one comes across news stories such as the one that follows.